So thank you all so much for joining us today. The topic for discussion is the day after tomorrow, an Australia-New Zealand water market update. My name is Lizzie, I'm from LVI Associates, and I'll be your host for today's session. Before getting started, I just wanted to go through a few reminders. Please do take note that the webinar will be recorded for future reference. Could I please also ask that all the audience do mute their microphone for the duration of the webinar? Lastly, we will be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions for our speakers today. We do only have an hour, so if time does permit, we'll try and get through all of them. If not, we will consolidate the questions at the end. We'll get the speakers to then, get their answers, and we'll get that sent out to the audience after the webinar. So yeah, let's start the session today. I'm really excited to introduce our panel of speakers that have joined me for today's webinar. So we have Lino Oddy, who is the General Manager at Huck Danaher, Daniel Lambert, the Australasia Water Lead at Arup, Elaine Pang, the Australasia's Water Strategy Skills and Leader at Arup, Richard Lynn, the Managing Director at Proxa, and David Middleton, the Executive Director at Jacobs and the Chairman of City West Water. So thank you guys so much for sitting down with me today. So for the audience that may not know, at LVI Associates, my team focus solely on recruiting mid to senior level professionals within the water industry, specifically within Australia and New Zealand. Our team, myself, I'm extremely fortunate to speak with leading water companies and leading water professionals every single day. And it is through these interactions that I've seen that despite the pandemic, the Australia-New Zealand water market is really booming, continuing to grow. I'm seeing companies continuously adding new headcount, which is really why I'm excited to sit down with the panel of experts today to get their insights on the Australia-New Zealand water market. So I think, Richard, starting with you, what have you seen has been some of the growth areas in the Australia-New Zealand water market?
Oh, thank you, Lizzie, and thanks for the introduction. Look, I can really only comment on the industrial water sector. So Proxa's business focuses mainly on that, and my recent experience has been in the industrial sector. So I won't talk to the immuni market at all, but in the industrial sector, we see significant growth areas in mining and mineral processing. There's been a significant growth in the agriculture sector, and specifically in relation to irrigation of wastewater and desalination, plus food and beverage as a whole. So we've seen significant growth in the mining and processing, mineral processing of gold, nickel, lithium, and a number of other component metals such as rare earths. These markets reflect the global growth in these commodities, but also the huge focus on battery metals for the electric vehicle market. So we're seeing significant opportunities for the water sector in those markets. We also see a growth in requirements for water recycle and an increase in environmentally driven projects, whereas previously there always had to be an economic driver. We've seen a number of occasions recently where projects have been put forward and been given the go-ahead where there is not necessarily just an economic driver, but also an environmental sustainability driver, which fits well with an increased focus on environmental impacts and recycling and reuse of water streams.
Okay, perfect. No, thanks so much for sharing. I think kind of Lino, you look at more on the technology, skills, project types. What do you think will be some of the main trends that we'll see in the water market for 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And I think also touching on what Richard said, and I'll touch on that in the sense of municipal. We in our market, as opposed to Richard's market with Proxa, we at Hark and the Danaher Water Quality are primarily focused on municipal markets. So in terms of instrumentation, filtration, and the technology. And what we see and continue to I think will best out in the future as well is in the municipal markets, a lot is going on in wastewater infrastructure. Some age around Australia is driving a lot of spend or a lot of money being put towards water plants. So a lot of companies are looking at making the Class A water for for irrigation purposes, etc. So that's really a big push that we've seen in Australia, and a lot of the projects that we've done in the past, and we certainly with Hark and some of the others that we have, we're seeing a lot of that drive into the next 2021, 2022. In terms of, I suppose, New Zealand, because of the some impetus from the situation that occurred, where there was an outbreak back in 2016, where I think 5 people were affected or became ill. A big drive in New Zealand on the drinking water side. So we see many opportunities in New Zealand on the drinking water side, more to meet the regulatory requirements. I think in terms of technology, what we have seen in our space is, and again, somebody mentioned, the digital side. We're certainly seeing customers are really looking for more than just a piece of equipment. They're wanting to see, I hate to use the complete solutions, but our customers today really are looking to get not just the equipment, but the data and the information to be able to allow customers to make sort of decisions on how to run their plant. So they're the things that we've seen in the past, and we that looking forward in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's something I've noticed a lot as well, as a lot of companies really moving to that whole digital solutions and providing the whole solutions as well. So David, which companies are you seeing as breaking trends in the water market in Australia and New Zealand? And what do you think that these companies are doing that's different and making them stand out?
Thanks, Lizzie. And I think I'll focus in on the trends first before I talk about one company in particular. We don't have a huge amount of time to drill into all the startups and all the people that are out there doing really innovative things. But if I look at the water industry post-COVID, and I think that's a really important lens, both from an engineering company perspective, but also from a water utility perspective, a couple of the trends that I'm seeing, particularly around further customer engagement, is obviously digital. And when I look at digital, I think we think of digital not just as digital engineering, but the overall digital transformation of a water company business or water utility business. So end-to-end digitalization of operations. So there's some really cool startups operating in that artificial intelligence, machine learning space, figuring out how to do more with less. One that I'm really, really impressed by is a company called Vapor, who have an AI engine that basically looks at your sewer inspection footage, so your camera footage, does it in about 1/10 of the time with a far higher level of accuracy, finds where your breaks, gives you reports, this is where you need to go and spend your money. So it's that concept of using technology to work smarter, not harder. I think the second thing I'm seeing, and I think probably the biggest trend, which if it hasn't broken yet, it's about to break, is around water industry decarbonisation. So here in Victoria, we've all had to make a pledge of how to get to zero emissions by 2030. That's driving a range of innovative technologies, particularly in the solar space, but also seeing hydrogen as a breakout technology that I think in the years to come, we're going to see be heavily aligned with what the water industry is doing, both from a water wastewater treatment perspective, but also in the way hydrogen is used to decarbonise the value chain through water.
Okay, great. And I think kind of like leading on to that, Daniel, I know like beyond Australia, you work with a lot with global associations, you have a lot of experience working overseas as well. I guess this kind of leads on quite nicely from what David was saying, with like new trends coming through, but like, how do you think Australia will keep up with the global water market advances?
Thanks, Lizzie. And I think obviously David touched on some really good points around some of the trends around digital and decarbonisation. But I think it's important for us as an industry really in Australia to understand what are the emerging trends and challenges, and how do we respond as individual utilities, consultants, technology providers, but also as a collective. And Australia is, when we talk about keeping up, Australia is already leading in a number of areas globally. And how do we take the clever things we're doing and share them and leverage them successfully? And there's some great examples around some of the work Australia's done in water security and how we've shared that into America, for example, in California. But there's also some really, I think that the connectivity we have globally and how we leverage the international organizations, consultancies, technology providers, and what's being happening elsewhere, and draw that best practice into Australia. So resilience, the customer, circular economy thinking, efficiency and optimization. There's all these amazing trends and opportunities for us as a water sector to not just respond to them, but actually help shape the future of cities and future of regional environments. And we have an opportunity to play a leadership role in that. But to do that, we need to sit there and say, well, what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and how do we apply digital? How do we apply thinking outside of our silo as just a water industry to respond to them and solve the broader challenges we're looking at?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for sharing, Daniel. I think also this kind of ties on really nicely what Daniel was saying, is having, what we can leverage from other water markets and other, global water practices. So Elaine, I know that you actually started your career out in the US and have since moved over to Australia. How do you think that the Australia New Zealand, water market compares to other countries, perhaps within APAC? Would you say it is falling behind, it's stagnant, or would you agree with Daniel that in some areas we are quite ahead?
Well, I think if we want to draw together quite a few of the concepts that my fellow speakers have just articulated, Australia is actually leading in water security because of the climate pressures that we're under. I know that in the past we've been asked to connect our clients with peers in California, for example, to learn from them on water security, but I'd argue that Australia is actually world leading in that space. And we're uniquely positioned to actually also lead what needs to happen in Southeast Asia and for some of these Pacific islands who are undergoing more climate stress for their own various reasons, whether it's sea level encroachment or drought. Those two extremes are things that we've dealt with across Australia and New Zealand quite well. So we are leading in that area, and then we can actually have direct access to best practice from around the world because COVID-19 has shown us that that's possible and technology supports it. And our clients are definitely quite open now to, it doesn't matter if the person sitting down the street from you, they're actually quite happy to get that international best practice in the door to them directly through digital means.
Well, and I think you made some really good points. I think, beyond just 2020 having this pandemic, it was floods, fires, droughts. So there's always, a lot of crises that we can kind of learn to develop and continue to develop on. So I'm sure in the audience, we actually have many business leaders who would love to find out from you guys what makes some companies so successful within the market, and then hopefully be able to kind of emulate that success. So I guess David and Daniel, from an engineering perspective, what do you think are some of the qualities that make key players so successful in the Australia and New Zealand market?
Thanks, Lizzie. I'll go first and then Dan can jump in. Look, I think, firstly, the market has become far more collaborative. We went through a period in the 2000s where we were all about alliance contracting, et cetera, but we went back to a more risk shedding rather than risk sharing model. But lately, I think our clients are more interested in how can we collaborate more deeply to get better outcomes for them and by extension their customers. So that, I think, drives the big players to really think about how do you better collaborate with your customers? How do you co-locate? How do you become more deeply embedded in what they're doing? And then that leads to the second part of it. I think we've become far more astute and understanding through working more closely with our clients in a partnering sense about their purpose. And so in my mind, aligning your services to their purpose means, certainly in our case, this is about more than just engineering. You've got to be good at engineering, and you've got to be good from planning through to delivery, and in some cases operations and maintenance support as well. But I really see the partnering approach is driving us to think about some of the things we do in a different way. For example, we talk a lot about the social value we're creating in creating infrastructure for water and wastewater, and starting to understand that infrastructure investment starts to drive better livability outcomes in cities and places. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then I think more deeply aligning with our customers' values and purpose. So things like inclusion and diversity, First Nations values of water, those types of things have become really prominent in our thinking as we work together. And I think other things that, aside from the engineering, which is not going to go away, those are the things that are really driving the industry forward.
Okay, perfect. I know, Dan, if you want to add on to David's comments.
He's stolen a lot of my thunder, which is great, because it's good to see that we're aligned in some of the things that are happening and the agendas facing the sector. And I think that, but I think there's some really good points there. And I suppose the question is, how do we, to be successful, when you're thinking, for those on the call, when you're thinking about your respective organizations, is how do you partner more effectively, both with collaborators, but with clients as well? How do you share knowledge? How do you become trusted advisors? And that is through looking at a relational approach rather than a transactional one. And that sort of continual reminder that as engineers, we're not just about concrete and steel or pipes and pumps, but we're about solving social challenges, environmental challenges, and helping drive economic value for both our clients, but for the broader cities and ecosystems that they operate within. And I think one of the other areas that I would say that, and David touched on it before when he was talking about carbon, but one of the huge opportunities in the water space really at the moment is that nexus around how do we not just think of ourselves as a water utility or water assets, but how do we think holistically around circular economy thinking? How do we try and drive outcomes that around energy, around waste, around that broader ecosystem, and we have a key role to play in that environment, which is actually really exciting because it diversifies what we do and the types of projects that we can get involved in with other sectors.
Cool. And I really like what you said there about, creating a relationship based rather than just transactional. I think this is something that can be applied to any kind of interaction within any company, within any industry as well. So I guess kind of similar question, but over to Lino, looking from more of a water technology perspective, what do you think are some of the qualities that make key players so successful, I guess more on the water tech side?
Just talking on mute then, I think.
Yeah,
and I'm the one talking about technology. So I think the key area for folks like Hark and Trojan, who play in the water space and always maybe deliver and drive on technology, I think companies are able to sort of quickly adapt to the market changes. I think they're the ones that are going to really succeed. I think also, companies like us that are in the technology game, we really need to be a lot more agile in, understanding not just the technology, what technology to bring forward, but also being more agile to the customer needs. And, also being prepared to, maybe not being so risk averse. I think, we have a propensity sometimes in the water market on the technology side to be a little risk averse. We tend to stick with maybe what we know when we're launching new products. And I think companies that are going to be able to try things out, be prepared to maybe fail and try other things to get to a solution, I think is where a lot of the technology suppliers will succeed. I think it's just finding that niche also, finding that niche in the technology customers are looking for, building that value proposition for the customer, and helping in doing that, helping solve the customer's needs. I think the key areas that technology companies like Harken, Trojan, and some of the instrumentation folks are going to be successful at.
Well, no, thanks so much for sharing. And I think that also leads quite nicely into our next discussion when you're talking about what technology to bring forward, the value of that technology. So of course, like another really hot topic, not just within water, but within every single industry, is really the introduction of digitalization and innovation. I think, David, you actually spoke at one of our previous events about emerging technologies within the water market. So it's a topic that's been around, for a few years now. But Elaine, I'm quite keen to get your thoughts on, what new and emerging technologies are you seeing in the market at the moment?
I think the thing to remember is that digital isn't the only new and emerging technology, but the critical thing is to have that develop that Lena was speaking about. And quite often the successful way to do it is to say, well, I'd like to be able to do this better. I can see that there's probably a new way to do it, but it's going to take me a little time. And if you're developing it alongside actually developing it the way you've always done it, you can actually use that to test bed your new approach as well. So that's an effective way to invest in a new and emerging practice. And then you can prove to everyone, yes, it works, and I got the same answer. That's a basic thing. And the other thing to remember is that new and emerging technology doesn't mean necessarily a step change. Quite often it's a way of combining technology in new ways to get a better outcome. So for example, with modeling, you can be looking at the fact that we used to model water and energy separately, and you could actually bring them together in a model. Or you're looking at economics as part of your water security planning now, and you can integrate those into one model, and that's actually a better outcome for everybody because all the inputs are consistent and they make sense to each other, and they all speak to the same conclusion when you get to the end of your work. And in terms of other new and emerging technology, blockchain, that's one where it might have been originally developed for banks to use, but now it can be adopted for water transactions. So it's exciting. It's about thinking about how do you take that other technology that already exists actually, but how does it apply to my situation? And always looking for a way to make things easier so that we can all take more holidays.
I think just another question to add on to that, because I know you're all very familiar with a lot of the different water markets. Which countries do you think are leading in terms of technologies and innovations within the water industry? This can be open to anyone.
Well, my gut reaction is the countries that actually invest in their universities and think tanks. So you've just got to look at which countries are doing that. I think Europe in general tends to invest a lot, but Australia has also invested a lot in our universities and think tanks.
Okay, perfect. Anyone else want to?
Not so much technologies. I would suggest that I'd probably add to the question of where should we be investing next, and what should we be doing to actually position ourselves to be leaders moving forward. And there's some areas where Australia really needs to be focusing, and what are the inhibitors to that? And often it's regulation. So and government, the way government approaches different aspects. So you look at bioenergy, for example, there's some real success in Europe and in California, but we need to be a bit more progressive in the way we actually help enable and facilitate new technologies and new approaches to ensure that we're delivering good outcomes from a water and waste and energy perspective. So I think, how do we help influence the change and drive the change would be something I'd add to that.
Anyone else want to add on to Daniel's comments?
I think it's driven by the requirements and the criticality of the issues in the marketplace as well. If you look at Singapore, Singapore's developed the water industry because it had to, because it was reliant on other sources of water. So it's about driving that. And if you look at Western Australia, our lack of rainfall over the last 20 years has driven desalination industry and requirements for that type of research and development. So I think where we respond to needs, I think that's where we get development. We get the development. But I agree with Elaine as well. It's where the investment goes into the universities and the think tanks.
So perfect. Actually, Richard, I had a question for you as well. So what startup companies, well, what advice, sorry, would you give to startup companies and say international companies that are looking to penetrate the Australia, New Zealand market? I know something that we've really established already throughout the webinar is that, you know, it is a hot market, it's a viable market, it's going to become more and more attractive to these startup companies and international companies looking to increase their presence within Australia and New Zealand. So what advice would you give to these companies?
Oh, thanks, Lizzie. Yeah, look, I can speak to that from a little bit of experience in terms of Proxa, because Proxa's main business has been in Africa. You know, it's been in Africa for 27 years and decided to get into the Australian market because it saw an opportunity. So I think that it wouldn't be unusual, and certainly when I was with GHD as well, we saw a number of, you know, Spanish companies and European companies coming into the market. The thing that I think differentiated the ones that were successful from those who weren't was the choice of local partners. And we talked about partnership and collaboration, and Daniel mentioned that before. If the international company can choose a strong local partner and work together either as a JV or as a partnership or some kind of investment vehicle, that tends to be more successful. And you know, then you get a combination of international expertise and technology together with local know-how and experience and relationships as well, because that's fundamental to business. So what happened with Jord Proxa, we formed a joint venture. Proxa brought the technology and Jord Engineering from Sydney brought the engineering capability and local relationships. And that's been very successful in the crystallizer market for us, where clients see the value in both businesses coming together. Essentially, both businesses have to provide value. And it's a requirement as well to understand that states in Australia are different. You know, you can't treat Australia as one market. Each state is very different and requires a different approach, possibly different partnerships, different relationships. And the other thing that's perhaps seen a few international companies come undone is they have to adhere to Australian standards. And Australian standards are very important, and they're different from some of the other parts of the world. And the other area is construction costs. You know, sometimes looking at design and how to design something that's in a remote location in Australia requires a totally different approach to looking at something that's designed in a large metro city in another part of the world. You know, we need to look at those particular needs, and they require a different design approach and a different thinking around costs. So there's some of the ideas, but there are lots of different requirements, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think having the ability to, adapt and, be educational and having to adapt to different regulations as well is something that you mentioned that I think is really important. I think Lino as well, you may have some good advice on that. I know you've had quite a lot of international experience. So what's some of the advice that you would give up to these startup companies looking to penetrate or enter the Australian, New Zealand market?
Yeah, I think I've probably what Richard just said. I think he's nailed it pretty well. Australian conditions are different. We have a relatively small population for a huge geography. Only 25 odd million people, and so a lot of differences in what the international markets look like in say Europe and you highly or densely populated countries. So we have quite a uniqueness here. So companies that come in, international companies come in, I do need to partner up with local expertise to open the door and get the traction they need. Again, as Richard mentioned, the certifications here are different. Each state is very different. In New Zealand is another kettle of fish. So people have to understand, or companies coming in have to understand those different regulations and requirements. So yeah, I'm probably just really echoing what Richard had. I think also I go back to the previous question is, a lot of these international companies that come in, I think they have to, again, build that big value proposition for the customer. Don't try and compete with all the other companies. Really need to find that niche and build that value proposition.
Okay, perfect. No, thanks so much for sharing your insights on this. I think a lot of people in the audience will really appreciate that, because I'm sure we do have a few people tuning in from outside of Australia as well. So actually another topic that I did want to discuss on the webinar is kind of one of the final discussion points, which is really focusing on what skills are in high demand, and how talent within the water industry is able to stay competitive. Honestly, like being a recruitment consultant in this industry, I work closely, with companies every single day to help them find top talent. And I do know firsthand how hard it is to come by, or how in high demand, water professionals are, and how hard to come by they sometimes can be. I'm sure you guys have all expanded your teams as well and may have faced similar issues. So I guess from my perspective, this kind of really links back to the topic of digitalization that has popped up a lot throughout the webinar. I guess in terms of, the audience that are looking to upskill their skill set, one thing that I have really noticed is, a rise in companies looking for individuals in the industry who do have an understanding of things such as AI, cloud-based platforms, big data analytics, smart meters, and how this is really able to influence the water industry, how it's able to increase efficiency, optimization, cost cutting as well. I don't know if any of you also want to add on onto this about how individuals can help to upskill themselves in the digitalization era. Anyone wants to?
Somewhat related to the previous point we were discussing, I was thinking about it. The one thing for either small companies or individuals to look at is what is the government sponsoring right now. So if you look in Queensland, Queensland government has actually sponsored a Queensland water modelling network, for example. So that's a big clue that that's a hot skill in demand right now, and that the government wants that that sector of the water market to be stronger and better better organized and better aligned. And that's a clue either for companies or individuals looking for where are their niches and what is their unique value proposition. In terms of other skills, I think you've still got to play to your strengths. So we can argue all we like that modeling is in hot demand, but if it's not the way your brain works, then don't make yourself go there. That would be my other piece of advice. So I've known quite a few people, because my background is modeling originally. You have to have a particular sort of brain for it, and if it's not working for you, you're better off looking at other engineering skills.
Cool. And I think something, Elaine, that you mentioned earlier before we jumped onto the call was actually about having like a multi-skill set. I mean, it's great to be a specialist in one area, but I think it's something that everyone mentioned earlier about having a wider ecosystem, wider eco skills. I've worked with companies that are looking for someone in water, but it's no longer, just a hard process engineer. I need someone that understands resilience. I need someone that understands climate change as well. So really just continuing to widen your breadth of knowledge is something that I've noticed is really important. I think as Dan mentioned, moving into that era of, sustainability is such a hot topic. So having an understanding of that is, something that's really, I guess from my end, is something that I'm seeing a lot of companies really appreciating at the moment. I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of add on to any of the skill sets that you'd be looking for.
Lizzie, I'd probably just add to it, and I agree with everything Elaine said there. To me, there's a couple of things at play here. There's the new emerging markets, which mean that companies like Jacobs are bringing different types of people into the organisation that we wouldn't necessarily have hired before. So, for example, you mentioned smart metering. I brought in a smart metering company. But I think on top of that, we should also recognise that the hardcore engineering work hasn't gone away, and in a lot of cases, there's actually more of it out there from a planning, design, construction, O&M perspective. As our population grows, as we need to build more infrastructure to service more people or rehabilitate the infrastructure we've got, We need more design managers, more project managers, more program managers, people with those types of skills. So to me, those skills haven't gone away. It might be, though, that the way the work is conducted requires you to build a different skill set in terms of the way you collaborate, the way you think more broadly about the impact of the work you're doing. And so to your point about having a sort of, multi-skill set that enables you to see more broadly than simply putting a pipe in the ground or pouring concrete is probably the types of skill development that we're looking for in terms of the people we want to hire.
Yeah,
and that relates to something I was thinking. Sorry, Richard, I'll just quickly go and then you can go. It relates to something I was thinking. Sometimes people aren't that unicorn with the perfect blend of skills you want, but probably the most essential skill is the ability to learn and grow. Over to you, Richard.
Oh, no, thanks, Celine. No, look, I was just going to agree. I think we talk about diversity a lot, and I think diversity of experience is really important. So, when we're looking for people, we're looking for people who've done different things, not necessarily in totally different industries, but even within the water industry, someone who's been in design and who's been in project management, but also is prepared to have been in construction as well, and actually understands how to build things. So I think it's really useful to get, and if you're a young graduate, to set a career path to enable you to get diverse experience. You can sometimes do that with one employer. You might have to move, and these days it's quite normal to move between companies to gain experience, and it's well respected and understood by employers. If it's for the right reasons, people don't mind that. And so I think I'd encourage everyone to get a diverse experience base. And and I think there were some questions on the webinar here about how you can get from an overseas position, how you can get into Australia and migrate to Australia. So we are looking for those type of diverse experience, someone who's been involved in those different types of application, whether they're in Australia or overseas. I think it's really valuable.
Definitely. I think they're all really good points. I don't know if Lena and Daniel, you kind of want to add on to this as well. I know you both probably expand your teams. So what would be some of the main things that you would really look out for, for team members of your own?
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. I think that diversity question that diversity opportunity is something that's really exciting for us, and we've seen diversity on multiple fronts, but the benefits that it brings in terms of different ways of thinking, different ways of engaging with clients, different ways of challenging the status quo, different ways of helping to build a broader network, and diversity of age, diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of different industries is something that's really powerful as well. And the thought, the ways of thinking and the ways digital, for example, is being applied in the transport sector or in the energy sector or in telcos. How do we share those lessons learned with our clients so that we can challenge them from this is the way it's always been done to what is the next evolution for their business and for our industry.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add there is we look at, if I look at the team we had at through the water quality group, we'd hired folks from many different countries around the world, some which we imported and some which were already employed here. And we looked at those folks that did have those multiple, those different skills. I think the key thing that stood out for me, though, was the ones that do well are the ones that take the time to learn the digital piece, the digital protocols, and especially in industry or in my specific market where we instrumentation and processing equipment, understanding the connect between, the customer's PLC or computer or SCADA system and our equipment. That digital piece has been very important. So those folks that not necessarily have an educational background in that, but take the time to sort of learn that and understand that are the ones that have been successful. Again, as you've still got to have your core knowledge, whether we've hired chemical engineers because we needed an application person, or chemists because we needed them to go out and apply laboratory equipment. That digital piece has always been, I won't say the challenge, but the thing that we've been looking out for in those candidates that come and want to work with companies like and Trojan and so forth.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's all really helpful advice. I think, Richard, you kind of just mentioned a little bit of this question earlier, but I think it does feed on really nicely with this discussion. So one question that did come up quite a lot with like the registration and the Q&A section was for people wanting to come into the Australian market that may not have existing experience already in the Australian market, maybe not understanding of design standards, regulations, water policies. I know, of course, hot topic is diversity, and I know a lot of companies are looking to, diversify their workforce. But what's some of the advice that you may give to individuals looking to come into Australia and find work or new opportunities?
Are you asking me, Lizzie?
Yeah, well, this is also open to everyone.
So I'll go first then.
Okay.
Look, I think people, when I've been in a number of roles in the water industry, and we've brought a number of people in from overseas, and it's 90% of the time it's very successful. So don't be disheartened, I would say, because the majority of people who come here do well. Australians receive people from different cultures and different backgrounds very openly. Australia is a very open country in my experience. I'm not from Australia, I wasn't born here, but as long as you work hard and are willing to try, Australia is a very good place to be, and Australians in general are very accepting, and we need more talent. So I think all companies are very open to bringing in talent and experience, and we're very blessed by people wanting to come and live in this great country. So, I think we should encourage it. We do encourage it as an industry, and as a country. I think it's very positive for us when we bring in these. We had some people. When I was at GHD, I had some engineers from Iran who worked in our water space, and they were some of the best engineers I've ever worked with. So don't be deterred. You can learn the standards. It's not that hard. It's not that difficult. It's just that you just got to pick it up, and as I say, people will embrace you. But also don't be afraid to send your CVs out to a number of organisations, and don't be disheartened at the first hurdle that you come across, because it's doable, and it's a great place to be, great place to live, especially Western Australia.
That's my hometown.
But David would say Victoria is awesome as well, for sure.
No, they're all good. They're all good. I mean, just choose where you want to live and turn up. It's all good.
Exactly.
Because I'm actually just being a little bit mindful of the time, because I know we only do have the hour. So we'll probably move on. I think this is a good place to move on to our Q&A session. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning, but if anyone has any questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So do just type your questions in there. As I mentioned, we'll try and get through some or most of them. If not, we will get the speakers to come up with their answers, and we'll get them sent out to everyone who has registered for the webinar. So actually, Elaine, a question has come in for you. It's actually about being a female engineer and what advice you would give to a female engineer looking to get involved in the water sector.
That's a tough question, to be honest. I'm in the Engineers Australia Committee for Women in Engineering, and it's something I grapple with personally. Is why should there be special focus on women in engineering? First of all, because we are just the equal of any man, to be honest, and it's more a question of persistence. I think obviously there is still cultural bias that we're overcoming. But as a female engineer, I've often been asked by some of the younger female engineers why they don't get to speak out in meetings. And I say to them, well, you just have to remember what is the point of the meeting, which is to help the client. And then if you just always keep that outcome in mind, in that particular answer I gave, the point is to help the client. So as long as you always pitch yourself towards that, you will get your voice. And same thing on a project. What is best for project? And it's not about being the loudest voice in the room and having just as much testosterone as the man, because that's not what it's about.
Cool, perfect. And I think like another really interesting question that has come through, and this may also be quite like a interesting question. I'm quite interested to get everyone's kind of take on this, is what global water market would you replicate for Australia, and why? And this is probably a very difficult question.
I see David shaking his head. It's a very loaded question.
It's a
well, maybe I'd flip that on its head. I mean, I look at if I look at it, why do we exist? What do we exist to do? And I'll look at urban water, but this equally applies to non-urban water. I mean, we exist to sustain life and sustain public health. So if you look at the model under which we work in, which for the most part water is regulated, and I heard what you said, Dan, about regulation, and I tend to agree with you. But through this lens, from a customer service perspective, what are we trying to do? We want to provide safe drinking water, remove wastewater and treat it, protect the environment, maintain public health, and do it in a way that enhances life and livability. And I'm sorry if anyone's from Melbourne Water, I stole that from you, but do it in a way that's affordable. I mean, we live in a place where water is valued, and we pay a price for it, but we pay a price that we believe people can afford to pay, and that drives our infrastructure investment. It drives the level of customer service standards. It drives the way we protect the environment. So I wouldn't want to replicate anybody else's water market here. I want to sell ours to everyone else in the world. I think we do an enormous amount of things right. Now we've learned from others. We certainly in Victoria we have a regulatory model that looks a bit similar to other countries. We've learnt in the technology space how to deal with water scarcity through recycling, desalination, groundwater, a whole range of things. We've learned from the best, but I think what we've been able to do here is to take the best in the world and mold it to a market that suits our unique conditions. And, at the end of the day, provides a service which is world-class and affordable for the people who live in this country. So my answer is I don't want anyone else's.
It's a good answer. If anyone wants to share their answers.
Well, if I could just, sorry, Dan, I would just like to inject a little bit of realism, which is that if you scan around the world, you'll see every place has one unique selling point that you'd probably like to take home. So let's give our great stuff to other places and bring their great stuff here as well. A great example is you look at Washington, D.C., and they've got, I think it's neighborhood homeowners will actually adopt storm drains. I think it's in DC. So that's a great program. Adopt a drain. Who would have thought of that? Let's try it. Go on, Dan.
No, I think that's helpful. I suppose I think most of us on this call would wholeheartedly agree with David around we don't want to adopt another global market, and Australia is leading in a lot of ways. How do we continue to help enable that? And part of that's through learning from each other and learning from global best practice and trying to develop in a bespoke way. But also it's interesting with Australia, with each state having different regulation and different enablers and different state governments having different areas of focus, driving fantastic outcomes. So there's good things that come out of that. So SA Water, for example, with their net zero electricity targets driven really by state government focus, what outcomes do we want to drive as a sector, not just at a state by state level, but as a nation, so that we can be leaders, and how do we have a really concerted focus on those, and how to share those lessons and export our learnings globally is an opportunity for us, and working with the WASs and the AWAs of our industry to help enable that is really important.
Okay,
Sounds
great.
like a good topic to discuss in Adelaide, Daniel. Maybe we'll talk about that.
That's right. We've got our National Water Conference in a couple of weeks, Oz Water, so I'm sure that will be front of mind.
Okay, well, just sorry, I know we're coming up to about 5 minutes left, a bit more than 5 minutes. So we just have like 2 more questions that have come through. So the first is, in water and wastewater treatment, 70% is pumping and motors. So there's a question around what energy optimization can be done. This is open to anyone as well.
I feel like I'm always the one answering, but so jump in if you got an answer. But it just brings to mind some of the things we've been looking at around optimizing. So you can look at energy trends. You know, you can look at the cost trends and then time your pumping to match that, so that you're pumping at the less expensive times. That's an easy no-brainer. And of course, you can start to, as an asset owner, if you have a lot of space over your assets, you can actually start to introduce solar.
That's right. And I would have said there's 2 parts of it. How do you optimize the energy usage, but also what is your source of energy? And solar being one of those opportunities, bioenergy being one of those opportunities, depending on where you are, wind, etc. But yeah, we need to look at the outcome we're trying to achieve holistically, and how do we deliver that?
I think if we look at from a technology perspective, a lot of focus for companies like Hark and Trojan and even Pour Water, we've really been heavily focused on the side, because that's where we see a lot of the biggest potential savings. You know, especially on getting the aerators or the to operate optimally, get the right levels of, you know, what is dissolved oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of our focus for Hark has been on delivering new products, or getting our products to be able to support applications in the wastewater side to deliver better optimization for the customer. Number 1 in terms of energy, and number 2 in terms of chemical savings. So that's where we're focused on, because we see those as big opportunities.
Cool. And I think the last question that kind of came through that probably once again ties in really perfectly with that previous question is, how can solar energy be used in water treatment?
Well, I'll build on what Dan said. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Victoria right now, where we've got the decarbonisation pledge here, we're using solar arrays to replace energy from brown coal. So about 30% of the energy that's needed to run the metro's operations, and also some of the non-metro urbans, is going to come from a variety of solar farms that are being put together by a joint venture of all the water companies. So I mean, that's one significant opportunity. There are certainly others. I mean, I've seen floating solar arrays. People, I think in Singapore, you know, the PUB has reservoirs with solar arrays floating on them. Are certainly something I've seen happen down in New Zealand as well. So there's all sorts of opportunities to look at where you have space, where you have land, where where you can fit it in. You can build solar arrays or solar farms that you can then use to power your various processes. You're on mute, Richard.
The other
Richard.
Sorry. I think that's really, really good. And also, I wouldn't take it away from remote locations as well, you know, off-grid opportunities in the agriculture sector as well, for irrigation, where power can be very expensive, you know, and the cost of power can be prohibitive against certain farming and crop uses, but solar is a significant opportunity to run remote water treatment plants or pumps and things like that. So that's a growing trend. Yeah.
Do you think that's something that's growing just like within Australia, or are you seeing that worldwide, really across APAC?
No, I think globally, where remote locations, I think irrigation costs and crops optimization of energy for crop production is very significant globally.
Cool. So Elaine, I think you wanted to add on there.
I'm just trying to think of whether it's relevant, but just thinking back to water and waste treatment and 70% being pumping and motors, the obvious no-brainer I forgot to mention is the amount you're actually pumping. So in some systems, there's a standard of maintaining a certain pressure, but you can really question whether that pressure needs to be that high or whether you can reduce it in certain zones, and that would save you a lot of energy. And to complement what Richard was saying about remote communities, battery technology has also come a long way. And there are certain batteries that work really well in hot environments now, whereas they didn't used to exist before. So that's another technology advancement that will help those remote communities.
Cool. I think that's like I think that's really a great point just to, kind of finish the webinar. I do realize it's come up to an hour now, went really fast, but thank you all so much, for listening in. Like, I think this is probably a really great place to finish up the webinar. So thank you all so much to our audience for joining. We really hope you enjoyed today's session. To our speakers, thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot. I think there's a lot of takeaway points, looking at, digitalization, new trends. I think where we kind of ended off in terms of looking at solar and what's developing in the water treatment, it's just making me think that we should hold another session to discuss this in even further detail. But yeah, no, a huge thank you to Richard, Elaine, Daniel, Lino, David. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think everyone's got a lot to take away from this session. So yeah, if you have any further questions, our audience, please do write them in the Q&A box still. Any other questions that you have, please do email in to us. We'll get them out to you, all the questions and answers out to you as soon as possible. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed today's session. Hopefully we'll see you again for our next session as well.